Hello everyone. In this short screencast, we'll take a look at the Scala interactive shell, which is called the REPL, which stands for Read, Evaluate, Print Loop. Don't be worried about the acronym. Once you start using it, it'll automatically make sense why it's called the Read, Evaluate, Print Loop. Again, if you're from a Python background, you're in familiar territory. It's very similar to the Python shell. So in the video, we'll be taking a look at one to really get started. So if you've not already installed Scala and if you don't have the REPL running already, this can be useful. If not, you can skip ahead. Post that, we'll take a look at a few examples of using the REPL, running some commands, and I'll share some tips with you which I found quite helpful when I've been working on using the REPL, sorry. And then finally, you might have this burning question as to why use a REPL? Why don't you just use the IDE of your choice? It could be the Scala IDE. So why do you want to use the REPL? And would there be a reason to use both the IDE and the REPL? So we'll cover that as well. So first things first, to make sure that you have the REPL running. Go over to the Scala website, that's scala-lang.org, and download Scala. If you've not already done that, you can find the latest version of Scala here. Make sure you've downloaded it, and you can follow these instructions here. Really two simple steps to make sure you have set your Scala home, so similar to the Java underscore home, and then finally making sure that the binary, the bin folder, is in the path. Also, as a prerequisite, of course, Scala requires the Java runtime to be available, so make sure that you have a JVM first before you actually run any of these commands. Alright, so once you've got all that set up, you can open a terminal session and you can run the REPL by using the Scala command. So, oops, Cala. Alright, so if you don't provide any parameter, Scala will by default get into the REPL interactive mode. So now that you're here, so let's run a few basic commands. Let's say, for example, we can run some simple examples like what exactly is, say, 2 into 5, for example, and it'll immediately calculate that and give you the result. It's also handy that anytime you run a command and it's evaluated successfully, it'll automatically put that into another result. So I can even print the result or just run res0. As you can see, it's quite handy when you didn't have to type all that. Of course, you can define variables and values. So let's say, for example, value x is equal to 5, and let's say var y is equal to 10. And then again, you can run commands like x into y. So this is probably overly basic, but you get the general idea. Any command or statement in Scala, you can run that within the REPL, and it's quite handy to quickly run these commands. Now, once you start using the REPL, you probably want to see some of the commands that you have at your disposal. So you can run the help command. So you can see all the REPL specific commands start with a semicolon, and you can see here a condensed list of all the commands at your disposal. One of the things I often do when I get into the REPL mode is I run a few commands, and then I made changes. Then on occasions I just want to run the whole batch of commands. So a command I find very helpful is to use the replay command. So you can type in replay. As you can see, it runs through all the commands that you have ever run and within that session. So once you quit this session and come back, of course, replay will not give you anything. So it's basically session specific. There's of course a history of all the commands that you have ever run. It maintains a history across sessions, which you can access using the history command. The other common thing I would do when I'm within the REPL is, instead of having to type everything, if I've already got those commands within a file, I can quickly copy and paste that. Let's say, for example, I have a command here, or a set of commands here. So I can copy and paste that, and I can run the paste command and paste that here. And as instructed here, once you're done with those commands, you can press Control and D, and then basically it takes whatever you pasted and it evaluates and interprets all those commands. So it's quite handy again, instead of having to type these commands over and over again. So that's great, but there's another option, which is basically we can run all these commands directly from the file, similar to running it like a script file, if you will. Before I do that, maybe I can just clear out all these objects that I've created. So the way to do that is to run reset, and it basically clears all the session history and all the interpreter state as listed here. So once you've done that, the other quick tip is to actually run or load the actual Scala file from within the REPL. The way to do that is run the load command, and you can specify the name of the file. So in this case, it's actually Scala, and I can paste that there, and you can see it. It pretty much does what you expect. It loads all the commands within the Scala file, and it interprets that. So those were some very, very simple examples of what you can do within the REPL. So again, imagine anything that you can do within the IDE. Of course, you could pretty much do that within the REPL. But then comes this question: why do you want to use the REPL? Or is there any reason to use both the REPL and the IDE? So I'd say there are three broad reasons why I think it's very helpful and useful to have the REPL. So one is, initially when you're learning how to use Scala, or how to program in Scala. So the REPL, of course, is really handy, because you don't have to create this boilerplate code, like define an object, and then create main and all that boilerplate code. So you could get started pretty much typing things, and the REPL behind the scene injects all of the required boilerplate for you. So it's really much faster when you're learning. The other reason is, I think of it more like from an exploratory standpoint. So when you're learning a language, or getting acquainted to a new API, I find the REPL quite handy. So as an example, if I wanted to run some command, and I see the result, and then I want to change that command again, the REPL is quite handy. So as an example, if I use this list that I've just created here, so some list, and now I want to explore that particular class. So then you can see that just by putting the period and the dot, it gives you all the functions, the methods that you have available for that particular object. So let's say, for example, I wanted to sum it. So again, it's quite handy. I press S and tab, and you can see it filter. So if I run sum, say for example, it as you would expect, it totals all the values, or the items within that list. So that's a good example of exploring um, a particular API or a library. The other reason I find the REPL to be very, very useful is, let's say, for example, you're calling a third-party API, and then based on the result that you get from the API, or it's a data-intensive process, it's some data analytics project. Based on the result of that data, you're trying to explore the content of that API, and then of course you could do that within the IDE, but then you run it. It takes maybe 5-10 seconds for the data to be retrieved or processed from the external API or your local data processing, and then it's very time consuming. And it's really about the velocity, if you will, of your development. So using the REPL, you're much more productive. The pace, if you will, of your exploration is much more improved. And then finally, the third reason I think using the REPL is quite helpful. It's more to do with the learning, but I'd rather think of it as improving. Improving one's capabilities and understanding of Scala. So if you had the IDE, and let's just say you're coming in from a Java background, and just for talk's sake, let's say you're not familiar with Java 8, the functional side of Java. You're still familiar with the older versions of Java or a language that's not really functional. Guess what you will do? Even though you have Scala, you still program in Scala just like how you would program in other languages. So again, if I use this list as an example, let's say you wanted to say take that list and say multiply that list by 2. I missed the caps here. Some, sorry. Let's, oh, if I can type, that'll be really helpful today. Some list. Yep. So let's say you wanted to write a simple piece of code to multiply all these values by 2. Again, if you did not come from a functional background, or if you weren't familiar with Scala, the functional programming side of things, lambda expressions, etc., you would have created a for loop and iterated through all the elements there, created a new list, etc. Whereas with Scala, there's simpler, easier ways to do that. So again, you could do this within the IDE, but chances are, when you are in the REPL, it forces you to think more creatively. So the way it could be done in one simple line in Scala is some list. I've got that correct this time. Map, and I could specify e such that the input parameter e into 2. Say for example, yeah. So this pretty much does exactly what we were discussing. So it basically multiplies that by 2. But again, when you are in the command line or the interactive shell, it forces you to think more creatively in a more functional programming way. So again, there are lots of other reasons to use the REPL, but I would say, given that this is an overview video, I'd stop by saying that these are my 3 favorite reasons why I use the REPL and why I use it in addition to using the IDE. Just before we wrap up, it's worthwhile highlighting that within the Scala IDE, you have something very similar to the REPL, what's called as the worksheet. Again, it's quite handy, but I'll cover worksheet probably in a different video. This was intended to be a quick overview of the REPL. So hopefully the video has been helpful. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.